Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis. Today, we are honored to host the transportation planner for the city of Los Angeles, Max Podemski. He is an urban planner, writer, and illustrator. Previously, he advised the president of Los Angeles City Council on citywide policy regarding transportation, planning, housing, the environment, the 2028 Olympics, which we might touch on, and on development and public works projects. His new book, which I just finished reading and love, called A Paradise of Small Houses, looks at both the history and the future of urban housing. He offers blueprints for how time-tested urban planning models can help us with building homes or apartments that we so desperately need today. So it's a fun book, Max. I really enjoyed it and enjoyed getting the history with these different buildings in various cities in the US, which also was interesting because cities have different models that they embraced. So welcome, Max. It's great to have you here with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's great for us too. So I'm going to start with some questions that may not be the obvious first starting place, but I think it's something that we're all up against when we try to get new buildings or apartments or housing approved, is the difficulties around zoning laws, regulations, bureaucratic procedures in dealing with any kind of out-of-the-box housing solutions. Do you have any ideas of how we can deal with that, or how they can be overcome?
Um, well, I think one of the main themes of the book is housing all over the world, but especially in this country, really is an expression of social values. But we've historically had sort of a value of those a battle between differing values as it relates to housing, right? So, um, we had sort of the founding fathers and the elite of this country who really viewed it as a land of single family homes and sort of anti-urban, people were to live in the country and be farmers. But then we've had, waves of immigrants who have come in and often lived in cities, and sort of because they were living in dense environments had to build dense housing. Um, and we have a very rich tradition of, dense urban housing in towns and cities around this country, but our land use regulations still really codify this ideal of a detached single family home. And, as we face this housing crisis, I really think that's, sort of what we're up against is the need for more housing, but land use codes that are sort of antiquated for the times.
Yeah, so this is one of the problems we have here too. And I think everyone I've talked to about housing and building, especially different types of housing, that come up against these things. And we did have a speaker a few weeks ago on zoning who talked specifically about that. So it becomes something then we have to really be activists around. And you also mentioned just now, and then you wrote about the sort of cultural fixation we have in the US, especially of single family homes. And this is the ideal that we have to all aspire to. Even if we're in an apartment today, the aspiration is the single family home. So I'd like that this is one of the values I think that you just were referring to. How do we expand this sense of housing where we get out of this need to see only one model as part of the American dream, but that we can be more broad-minded with solutions?
Well, I mean, I think, at different life stages, people need different housing types. For example, I have two kids and, we are fortunate enough to live in a single family home with a yard. But at other stages in your life, you might want, a smaller place to live or, a different configuration, where you're able to have, extended families live together.
Mhm.
Um, and historically in this country, people had a lot more liberty to sort of adapt their living spaces to meet their needs, right? So if we're talking about Chicago, when it was first developing in the 19th century, an immigrant might build a very small wood cottage and then over time, add extensions onto it and even lift it up. And through that, they were able to leverage that property and make income off of it. But also, create space for their relatives or, people, other immigrants from maybe where they came from to live. And I think that's sort of one of the issues with how we're planning our cities is we're not allowing that natural evolution. And we're sort of, trying to freeze areas physically. And I think that's really to the detriment of their social character because, we were just talking, we have neighborhoods that at one time may have been, very economically diverse and, professors, different types of people living in them that have now become extremely expensive.
Yeah, like where I used to live in LA. You mentioned, this is a great quote that was in your book from Justin Trudeau. Homes are for people, not investors. I love that quote. And one of the problems we have in the Sonoma region and Napa and probably down there too, is the problem of vacation rentals and second and third homes that take a lot of housing off of the market. And you mentioned that in Vancouver, 12% of the condos there are vacant most of the year. What do you think should happen to these second and third vacation homes? And maybe even what's your opinion of Airbnb?
I mean, I think Airbnb is a pretty pernicious problem because essentially they're, weaponizing the housing crisis in a way because you have very valuable real estate in certain areas and people are able to make more income from renting it on Airbnb than, renting it to a person that might live in their long term. And yeah, in tourist areas, it's a huge problem. I mean, one of the cities I write about in the book is New Orleans, where, if you go to the more central areas of New Orleans, I mean, like half the houses seem like they're Airbnbs. Um, because you can rent those out for way more money than you could rent it out on the standard market.
Yes.
But I think ultimately, that's a function of not enough supply. We need to build more housing in these areas. And I think we also need more regulation. In LA, we actually have created a partnership with Airbnb where they're sharing their data, and that's really cut down on the amount of, illegal rental units here.
Oh, that's
But I
interesting.
know that can be a problem because a lot of people, if you're, you bought your home a long time ago in Los Angeles and the city has become incredibly expensive, they gain income from renting it out. So there's you know there is a big opposition to, regulating the Airbnbs.
And sometimes it pays the increase in property taxes.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing. And the other thing you talk about a lot in the different cities that you write about are when they build some of these condo or apartment places, housing, they are built near transportation hubs. There might be shops nearby. And this is something I saw a lot and see a lot in Europe, where big apartment buildings will be on maybe corners of where there's a park and they'll have shops in between them, a big garden park in between them. And then public transportation, their trams, their buses, their ways to get out of that area into downtown. What do you see happening in LA around that transportation?
Um, well, yeah, I mean, one of the big things I talk about in the book is our housing really is a product of transportation systems. And sort of going back to an earlier question about single family homes, Philadelphia, which is the first chapter in the book, was founded by William Penn, who was, sort of this Quaker radical and wanted to build a utopia in the US. And he had just come from England, where he experienced, the plague and the Great Fire of London, where London was this incredibly congested, compact city that basically burned entirely to the ground. And he wanted Philadelphia to be what he called a green country town. And so he laid it out with these large lots or these large blocks and then quarter-acre lots that were designed for freestanding homes that would be surrounded by a garden. And Philadelphia, as we know, ended up being extremely successful. People flocked there from Europe, but they didn't live in those quarter-acre lots. They basically huddled close to the Delaware River and divided these lots to as small as, 10 feet wide and built row houses. And the reason for that is because, back in the 17th century and 18th century, you wouldn't want to walk, across town to do all of your daily needs. You need to be close to each other because walking was the way you got around. And that sort of marked, our early colonial cities. And that's why you have this density, especially in Europe, but also in the Northeast, in cities like Boston and New York. But then as we get to the 20th century, we have new means of transportation that are allowing cities to grow and sort of transcend these really dense conditions. So with streetcars and rail. And if we look at, an early picture of the New York City subway, or even down here with our Pacific Electric rail system that LA once had, they went through open fields. And so the train came and then the development came. And that's why you really had these concentrations around the stations where you would have, retail hubs. Then you might have a row of apartments, and then you would have single family homes. So that's, pattern very prominent in Europe and lots of cities. Even here in LA, if you go to, well, now we're starting to rebuild it. But, for example, if you go to South Pasadena, you have this sort of little downtown where we rebuilt the rail station, or Pasadena, and then going out, and I'm sure similar situation in the Bay Area. But yeah, now there's a lot of increased regulations. We call it transit-oriented development, to really concentrate development around rail stations and give extra incentives to build around those. So one, policy that we have here in LA that was actually a product of a ballot measure is called the Transit-Oriented Communities Program, where developers get extra density and reduce parking requirements for including affordable housing in a development around transit hubs. So that's rail lines, but also high frequency bus lines. And so, LA is sort of, marked by these long commercial arterial streets like Wilshire Boulevard or Sunset Boulevard. And historically, they've been sort of lined with 1- and 2-story buildings and strip malls and gas stations. And we're really seeing that those land uses change and being replaced by 6- and 7-story buildings because of that policy. And a lot of those policies now have been implemented statewide, where you're now allowed to build denser development along commercial corridors.
Yeah, we talked, or we mentioned the other day about the type of housing that might be appropriate in terms of being affordable, first for middle class people, which would include teachers, and then for lower income people. Are there any types of houses that you think would be more affordable for these two different types of people that could be included in plans for development?
Well, I think, going back to our zoning codes and building regulations, I think one of the main issues is they really prioritize two types of development. So one is, single family homes on a 50 by 100 or foot lot, which are now, prohibitively expensive in most of coastal California. And then on the other hand, very large development. So, 6- and 7-story development, often on commercial boulevards. And there's a whole range of housing that's missing from that, that I describe in the book, which is, 2- to 4-unit buildings. And these are inherently more affordable because they, have to be at a smaller scale. And if you imagine, right, taking a 50 by 100 foot lot where there's one home, and if you're allowed to build 4 units on there, you're dividing that by 4. And also because those larger developments tend to be built by very large, experienced developers that know how to play the political system and know how to maneuver zoning codes, and they build the most expensive product possible. And that's also a function of the fact that there's usually very little land in most cities in California where you can build dense development. So when they are able to build on there, they want to get the best return as possible. But this missing middle development, it's often a way to create more smaller, affordable units because it's more mom and pop developers who tend to be building for their own community as opposed to, the luxury market.
And that's what we need more of. We don't need more luxury market. I put two things into the chat box that relate to information you sent me yesterday, because I was fascinated by some of the buildings that had been used for different kind of housing. And the one that just blew my mind was this tiny tower. I just couldn't believe it. So I put the links to these different housing plans, and it shows the interior. That's what I was curious when I saw the exterior in your book. I thought, I need to see the interior. How does this work? How could people live in these small towers, basically? I think they're 3 stories. Is that correct?
Yeah, so Tiny Tower is sort of an updated version of a building type called the Trinity Row House from Philadelphia. And this really, I think, illustrates how sort of lot sizes can dictate, the price of a building. So going back to Philadelphia, we have William Penn who hires a surveyor to lay out this plan for his city, which is a grid with these very large blocks and sort of these main streets. But what ended up happening, as I described, is, people divide these large blocks. They cut alleys down the middle of them. And if you're ever in Philadelphia, there's a very interesting street called Elfreth Alley that's right on the Delaware River. They call it the oldest street in America, but it's this tiny little street with tiny little houses. Um, and what would happen was along the main streets, so the ones laid out by Penn Surveyor, you would get these very large colonial row houses, 3 and 4 story townhouses where sort of the elite of the city would live. And those would often be on 25 by 100-foot lots. And then on these alleys, you would get very small Trinity apartments. And those would be on 10-foot wide lots. And it would be 3 stories with a single 10 by 10-foot room on each floor. And that's why they called it the Trinity, because it's like the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And so you would have a situation, and this lasted into the 1920s, where, near Rittenhouse Square, which is sort of the fanciest district in Philadelphia, you would have like America's society, its upper class elite living on the main streets in these very large, lavish townhomes. And then directly behind them, you would get a factory worker living in this very small Trinity. But I think the Trinity illustrates the ingenuity of early builders and of these housing types. Because when I say 10 by 10-foot room, it sounds horrible, right? But one of the things I did while researching this book is, I tried to stay in these buildings, and I stayed in one. And because of the ceiling height, and they have windows, they're actually, light filled, really nice spaces. One of the innovations they have that make them not for everybody is these very compact, steep staircases where you actually have to hold a handle to go up them. But their compactness sort of allows that vertical density. And so, that a Trinity might not be a house, you would want to live with 2 kids, but, it's a great house if you're, an empty nester or 2 people. Flashing forward to Tiny Tower. So currently, Philadelphia is having something of a renaissance. People are moving there. It's much more affordable than New York City or Washington, D.C. And you still have this situation where you have these alleys and you have these tiny legacy lots where maybe a Trinity was on it at one time and they've been ripped down. And so this architecture firm called ISA built an updated version of the Trinity, which is a very modern looking building, but still 10 by 10 foot, and prefabricated this steel stairway. So I think the house cost about $250,000, and 100,000 of that was fabricating the stairway, but they moved it to the front of the building, and it's actually sort of this screen where you have windows facing the sidewalk and the stairway in front of those windows that actually sort of creates this perforated screen, providing privacy to the interior. And I was able to go inside it, and it's a wonderful building. And I think an example of, going back, a single family home is the only decent way to live. And I think we think that because it's like, we need open space, we need privacy, we need light-filled buildings. But if it's well designed, you can have all those qualities in an extremely small, compact house, and also, live in, dense, vibrant neighborhoods near restaurants and shops and transit and your job.
Yeah, that's the fun thing. Whenever I've been in Europe a lot, and I never have a car, I never rent a car, never need it, because everything is so close. Cafes, shops, everything, transportation, public transportation is so good. I want to mention one of the last things, and I did put in the chat box because I want everybody to check those out later, not necessarily now, but it's really interesting to look at these different house designs. Did you draw all those in the book, Max?
Yeah, I did.
That is so cool because they look great. And to be able to read about them, and then you'll say, check out figure 21, and I go look at the figure and you see what the house looked like. And then I thought, I want to see the interior, which some of this does. But yeah, it's really nice to have those examples in the book. And I want to mention one thing we talked about, and then I'll go to audience questions, just as we were beginning today, and that is the housing in Vienna, how they figured out renting. Apparently 80% of the people who live in Vienna are renters, not owners. So it's a really different way of looking at housing. And it is not market rate. They have public housing, lots of apartments that are public housing. And they say 80% of the people will qualify for their public housing. So it's all different income levels, and it's tied to income levels rather than um, market rate. Do you have any thoughts about tying rent to income levels rather than market rate, what the market will bear?
Well, I think, to answer your question in a roundabout way, I think Vienna is a really extraordinary model. Um, you know, I am someone who believes we need to build much more housing, and that's sort of at the root of our housing crisis. But I don't think that, building a ton of housing will solve the housing crisis. And I think there are the lowest income people, will always have to have some sort of subsidized housing. And so the Vienna model is, social housing that's actually built and subsidized by the government. And the closest thing we have to it here in the United States is public housing, that we built a lot of in the, 30s up to the 50s. But that wasn't really social housing like they had in Europe, because the social housing in Europe tended to be built on the periphery, and it was really to relieve, overcrowding and dilapidated housing, and provide housing for people. Whereas our public housing in this country was really a mechanism of slum clearance. So we would go into these old dilapidated neighborhoods that were defined by the type of housing that I describe in the book. So, tenements, workers' cottages, demolish them and then build, these high-rise housing blocks. And so oftentimes you'd actually get a net loss of units, and you would replace these really character-rich neighborhoods. You at least I do, look at pictures of these old neighborhoods and you weep because they're so beautiful. And you can just imagine that they would be, extremely desirable today just because of, their character and their location in their cities and their, the street life they promote. But yeah, I think, Vienna is a great model, but I think one of the issues we have in the United States is, um, you know, we don't like the government sort of interfering in the private market. And in order to build this public housing, you'd have to have the government be sort of a participant and developing its own housing and also creating profits from that housing. Because I think that's, something people don't know is, the housing in Vienna, it's not just for the very poor, it's for all classes of society. And, the more expensive apartments end up subsidizing the lower income apartments. But it's a model, not just in Vienna, but Singapore and places around the world. And I think it's definitely a model, if we're really serious about alleviating the housing crisis, that we should look at in the United States.
Yeah, we have definitely a severe housing crisis, and with so many people homeless, that becomes, well, that's a whole other discussion probably. But I do want to open this up to people who might have questions for you. And while they're thinking about it, Ben, you go ahead. Unmute, Ben.
Okay. Uh, I'll get on screen here. Yeah, I'm very glad to be able to address the speaker because I wanted to ask a question of someone who actually is in the field about one of my pet ideas. And whenever I have an idea that I don't read somewhere else, I think I should check around and see if this is, just my own private fantasy. And I wrote a letter to the editor, to the PD, a few months back, where I had a proposal for how a progressive politician in California could get elected by acclamation, which is to resolve the homelessness problem instead of looking at it as we have been, which is a matter of supply. We have a patchwork of nonprofit programs and government institutions. It doesn't add up to a solution. And when people talk about the problem of crime in the United States, a lot of I think people point to the fact that, well, the stats are going down, but the perceived sense of social disorder is high. And that is because of the concentrations of homeless populations in the center of cities, in the downtown districts of cities. And this is one of the things that Gavin Newsom is trying to address. The beginning of the year, they passed some legislation which will allow people to be incarcerated or put in custody in order for their, for mental health purposes, which is a long time coming. So my question was this: if we took the supply question off the table by bringing in, we could get the federal government to send us 10,000 FEMA trailers if we needed to, and set up something like the water department has hundreds of acres of land. It's on a bus route. You could set up Quonset, like modulars there, which would have an intake, social worker, job placement. Every person there would have a place to stay with a lock and their name on a card. That way you could say, all right, homelessness is over because there is no need for you to be living under a bridge because we have a place for you. This could be done in a year. You could actually end public homelessness in the state of California. That would be so why can't this be done? That's my question. Why is this not feasible?
Good question.
Well, I mean, we have seen here in LA, and I'm sure in other parts of the state, they are building, very rapid, they call it interim housing. So they'll take, a vacant lot or an underutilized city property and put up, tiny homes on them. So, they're essentially just shelter, and, they'll have like a shared restroom facility. But I mean, that's not housing, right? So it's called interim housing because it's essentially to get someone off the street, and then the goal is to get them into a permanent house. So I think the permanent housing part of it, I mean, that is the supply question, right? Because there's a deficit of housing for all people in California, and the affordability issue is an issue for all people in California. And, the people who unfortunately end up on the street, are sort of the ultimate victims of that.
So
So
my question is then, if you take that supply issue off the table, because we actually could supply enough housing units to take the homeless people and say, okay, you do not have, this would actually allow municipalities to outlaw public homelessness in good conscience, because no, you have a place to stay. The issue of whether we have housing or not has been resolved. We do have housing, which means you get to stay. You cannot stay on the street. You go to this place if you can't buy housing.
well, the issue is that, I mean, a lot of the unhoused population, they come from these areas, right? So they're a
Mhm.
person that might have lived in, you know, a certain neighborhood and had medical bills or fell in hard times and now they're on the street.
Right.
So we need to find, you know, if you built a, you know, a big camp for, you know, to house people, you know, in the Central Valley somewhere, right, or 100 miles from where they live, they probably wouldn't want to go because, you know, their social network is in a certain neighborhood, their community is there. So the issue is being able to find sites um, in uh, in these dense urban areas for people to live. And, you know, even with like, for example, these tiny homes, you know, you can't build enough supply. I mean, here in LA, we have, you know, 60,000 people on the street. So, you know, you really do. I mean, it's a, it's about, you know, taking the supply issue off the table. Well, you can't just put that supply anywhere in the state. You have to put it in the places where people are. Um, so I think, and that's the issue. It's finding the land, and even for, you know, small interim housing, it's very difficult. And I mean, if you can look up, you know, some of these places in LA that they're, you know, putting people, they're literally like the shoulder of a freeway or, you know, wedged. I mean, it's like, and I was involved in that, um, you know, in my previous job is like trying to find these sites. It's very, it's a lot more difficult. And I mean, that's, you know, you drive around and you might see like this huge empty lot, right? But that lot is owned by someone. And in order for the city to put, you know, fill that up with, you know, housing, I mean, they want money for that and all that stuff. So, and that's not even to mention, right, the backlash between communities where they don't want that type of facility in their neighborhood. So it's quite a, you know, complex issue.
Well, it seems like we have plenty of housing, plenty of luxury housing anyway, but not, I think Kimberly, you had your hand up? Go ahead.
Think I'm mute. Hi, Max. I wanted to, it seems obvious to me that there are a lot of answers that are obvious in terms of solutions, but the problem is in terms of the decision makers not making the decisions to move forward. So Sonoma is a perfect example. One of the things that just completely drives most people I know in the neighborhood that I live is the vacant places. And I know that there are other communities that set up a vacancy tax. And basically, it's turned out to be an incentive for you to either fill it by renting it or selling it, so that you've got 2 years at a certain tax rate, and then 2 years later it goes up and it goes up and it goes up until you go, ooh, I can't afford this anymore. So I have discussed this with our planning commission, and they've basically said, well, it doesn't bring in that much revenue anyway, and it's really difficult to do, and to get it done, it's just too much work. So what is your argument towards that, or what is a coalition one could build to get that moving forward so that there could be a change?
Well, you know, I think a vacancy tax, it is, I mean, I think that does make a lot of sense. I think it should be extended not just on, you know, vacant units, but also, you know, vacant land. You know, you drive through LA and we see all these vacant parcels that, you know, people have low property taxes on, and they're essentially just sitting there speculating on it,
Exactly.
for a long time. I think the issue, I mean, I don't know, the situation in Sonoma might be very different because of the, um, you know, tourist economy and the, you know, vacation homes there. But in LA, there's actually not, the vacancy rate is extremely low. And when you look at what the vacancies are, you know, the vacancy rate is a snapshot in time. And so that means, you know, if you moved out of your house and it's in the process of being sold to another person, that's counted as vacant. Or if you moved out of your apartment, that's counted as vacant. But the vacancy rate is actually in our large cities is not, you know, it's too low, it's much lower than it should be. But I mean, in terms of solutions, I mean, that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, is because we have this housing crisis. You know, the battle tends to be about, you know, we need to densify neighborhoods. And when you say that, people automatically imagine these huge slab-like apartment buildings that are, you know, in a lot of cases, totally out of character with what's there now. But something I'm trying to point out in this book is, you know, we have this huge diversity of housing types, especially here in California. I think uniquely in California, where you could walk by them and not even know that they're 3 to 4 units. And I think if you walk through downtown Sonoma, you can see this, right? You know, 3 units, 4 units, bungalow courts.
Right.
And you know, I think that's sort of a solution that we should be looking at, right? Because it's sort of this medium between you know, huge apartment buildings and single family homes. And I think another thing, you know, another point that I'm trying to make is we think about the American dream in this country as like a single family home and a white picket fence. That's like the example of economic ascendance and security. But the reality is that it's more like a triplex. Because if we look at these cities, it was often, you know, you would have an immigrant, they would come in, they would live in, you know, a central area in a tenement or a very small apartment. They would gain, you know, some meager amount of wealth, and they would move, you know, a little farther out and build a 2 to 3 unit building that they would rent out, and through that, you know, pay the mortgage and also provide housing for, you know, people in their community. And we're sort of seeing that coming back a little bit with accessory dwelling units, right? So you own a house, you can build that accessory dwelling unit, and you can, you know, rent it out to someone. You can put your, you know, son, you know, home from college in there, or you can, you know, Airbnb it and make money that way. But and it's been very successful and it's been adopted across the state. You know, what about scaling that up, right? Instead of just building an ADU, you could build, you know, a 3 to 4 unit building in your neighborhood.
In your backyard.
Yeah.
You know, another, and I'm going to go to Katie next, but another problem is we have just a plethora of developers who come into an area like this, which is, as you said, it's a tourist area, it's wine country, that want to come in and build luxury condos or luxury homes, and then they're spec houses, basically. And this is another problem that is kind of at the other end of needing housing for people who are not at that income level, but it's just exacerbating the situation, I think, when developers are it's really about greed. It's not about what people need. So that's something we have here a lot more, and we have a lot more vacancies than you have in LA, clearly. Katie. You want to unmute, Katie?
Sure. Yeah, thanks so much, Max. Georgia had another really interesting guest on, what was his name again, Georgia? That wonderful housing guy from New York. Anyway, sorry to put you on the spot, but we can circle around. We can Google it and circle back around. But anyway, he was very good too. And one of the things I asked him was something about can we push on the president or Biden, you know, and he explained that we are state governed, so it's state by state, and the federal government doesn't have much power, et cetera. So I have a lot. I guess I have one question, but I'll back it up with, I mean, I spent my morning calling low-income housing to find out I can't even sell my house and move into a low-income place in this town because I would need a minimum of a cap of $75,000 in the bank, and I would end up with 200,000 in the bank. So they want you poor, so then you're there, and then you don't have any money to go out and have fun. It's a oxymoron, but these are all things you know about, I'm sure. So here's my question, and I'm sure you're going to be pushed hard on this solutions issue because there's a lot of pain out here. There's a lot of pain that's not being acknowledged yet. It's not being recognized. There's suffering. You know, shelter is as basic as groceries. And so here's my question. How do we make this a louder issue? How do we get the attention of politicians? There seems to be some, yeah, I saw you, Kimberly, because I know I appreciate your comments too. It's getting passed over. It's getting some double speak, you know, housing, but, and the thing is, the vacancy tax, that's not gonna, rich people don't care about another extra tax. But anyway, so here's my question, how do we get more attention, make this a big deal?
Well, I think the housing crisis, I mean, it is a big deal because it affects everyone in the state. I think one issue that we have here in LA, and I suspect across the state, is if you look at, you know, areas in North America that are known for planning and that have been, you know, successful at adding new housing or doing innovative things, it starts with a very deeply engaged conversation with the whole community about how do we want our city to grow? What do we want our neighborhoods to look like? But it has a caveat of, you know, not growing is not an option, right? We're going to grow whether we
Yeah.
like it or not.
Yeah.
You know, it's our choice of how it's going to look. And so that's what we've seen, you know, in Vancouver, where they've added lots of housing, or Portland, Oregon. And, you know, in California, we tend to like resort to these silver bullet things. So like these statewide propositions that are made by the legislature, you know, where there's often a lot of pushback because people say, you know, this is a one size fits all approach. And I think oftentimes they're right, because there is a huge diversity, you know, in the state. And as we've, you know, alluded to in this conversation, LA is very different than Sonoma, and, you know, Sonoma is very different than San Francisco. So I think, you know, we need to urge our politicians, but also as a community, you know, to come together and have a conversation about growth and what we want that growth to look like, and how we're going to add housing in a way that's, you know, affordable. And, you know, if it's social housing, you know, how we're going to do that and make that happen, because that's something where you need a robust community partner. And you also need to, you know, where is that public housing going to go? What is it going to look like? So I think that's one, you know, tangible step, right? Is, you know, it sounds like you guys are already pretty organized in your community, is to sort of, you know, start that conversation.
Well, again, not to take up much more of my allotted time here, but we have had those meetings and everybody has pieces of paper and they put dots on pieces of paper, but the rich people don't want to, they don't want anything there. And so they bring some of the homeless people, and they add one or two little pieces down here in the mixed neighborhood, and that's the end of it. I don't know how it is in Ohio or Wisconsin, but it doesn't seem to me it's getting much better anywhere, Max.
Well, I mean, that is a major issue, right? Is a lot of the local policy and conversations about land use is dominated by, you know, homeowners, right? And their goal is to, you know, protect their home values, right? Or their perceived home values. And so we get policies that make it very difficult to add new housing into neighborhoods. And I think, you know, in LA, and I'm sure it's similar in the Bay Area, you know, over half the people are renters, they're not homeowners. And so, you know, we need to start creating policies that, you know, take into consideration of renters as much as we do, you know, wealthier homeowners.
Well put. You know, one of the things you just said, which I think is important, and Kimberly, you can answer this if I don't have it right, but I know the meetings that took place in our community about the need for affordable housing. I don't know if they ever looked at how do we want the community to develop? How do we want the community to grow? What are the values we want in growing the community, because it will grow? Was that ever part of the discussion or not?
Actually, yes, absolutely has been part of it. But you end up with just a, you know, little progressive coalition who thinks this is a great idea. And then somehow there's not the resources to move forward to get the decision making or the implementation of it all. But the city has started to very slowly do some things in terms of building, like they've cut down their various fee levels. And I think some of you know, my husband for a while wanted to build a housing unit on 5th Street, and bought the property and was going to build it for no profit, just to build it. And just because of the cost of the land and the hookup fees and the everything, it didn't, you know, what's the word, money out, you know, it didn't
Yeah,
make
pencil
any
out.
sense. Didn't pencil out because of all of the fees to make no profit at all. So it was crazy. And those are the kinds of things the city is slowly working on those, but nothing yet in terms of vacancy tax.
Okay.
Yeah, that is a huge issue as we, tend to use new development as a way to fund parks and schools and all these impact fees, and it ends up becoming very difficult to, build housing and especially affordable housing, right? Because after getting paid for all those fees, you want to charge as much rent as possible.
That's the other thing. I'm a renter and definitely found a good deal, but good deals are very hard to come by in the area where I live, just like where I used to live in LA. I keep getting pushed out of these areas.
Yeah.
Except the Pacific Palisades when it was, but a lot of people could live there. And now it's, the movie stars with huge incomes, and it's a really different town, or kind of
Well,
a
you
town.
good taste and you pick really nice places to live.
I have picked nice places to live. And the other thing I was going to mention, it's not quite about housing, but it's related because you're a transportation person. I did live in LA when the 1984 Olympics were on. And it was so interesting how Mayor Bradley got the work hours staggered in that city. And I'm wondering, since you've been an advisor on it, if they're going to do something like that again, because there were no traffic jams. It was incredible.
Um, I haven't heard about, I mean, we're pretty far out, so I think
Oh,
policies
right.
like that might come. But basically what they're trying to do is a budget Olympics here.
Mhm.
So LA, we're fortunate we have a lot of the venues already built.
Right.
Um, so we're using a lot of existing sports venues. One thing we are looking at is, really reimagining our streets and public rights of way to, so for example, Olympic Boulevard, creating bus only lanes there, right, where you can get transportation networks on these streets
Mhm.
to get people quickly where they're going. And we also happen to have, a lot of investment that was sort of happening regardless of the Olympics. So we passed a transit tax and a park tax, and so we're building out our transit infrastructure and a lot of things to be that sort of coincides with the games coming.
Right. Now, the train that goes from, is it Pasadena out to Santa Monica? What is that line now? How much?
The E line, yeah.
Mhm. And where does it start and where does it end?
Well, that starts in Santa Monica and ends in East LA. And
Okay.
that was sort of like cobbled together. So the first line went from downtown to Culver City, and then they built an extension to Santa Monica. And then the newest part was they built sort of a new subway through downtown LA to connect it with the line to East LA. But the big one that's coming that I really think is going to be transformative is the Wilshire Boulevard subway that's going to
That's
extend the subway all the way to Westwood. So it's going to be 25 minutes from Westwood to downtown LA, which I think is going to be pretty transformative.
wow. I mean, one of the reasons why I never liked going down to downtown LA is driving down there. So yeah, this would be incredible to be able to do that. So does anyone have any last question about housing before we um, finish? Or do you have something you would like to tell us that I didn't ask about, Max?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think we've talked a lot about luxury housing, right? And I think a lot of the buildings that we see built in our communities, they're for the richest members of society.
Right.
And that's kind of, almost an anomaly if we look historically at housing. And the title of my book, A Paradise of Small Houses, that was a Harper's Magazine quote from the early 20th century about a neighborhood in Philadelphia.
Hmm.
And it was considered this amazing place because a factory worker, owned his own small row house, with a backyard and everything. And the row, these row houses were considered so special that there was even a model of them built at the World's Fair in Chicago. And so I think that's, we have all these wonderful models of uh, sort of the opposite of luxury housing, right? Of housing for working people, but that's still, you know, light filled and has green space, and which also contributes to really character rich, walkable, livable neighborhoods. And you know, we need to get back to building that type of housing.
Yeah, totally agree. Well, this has been very interesting, and I know some people have put a lot of comments into the chat box, and I would recommend that you get the book as well, because it's really fascinating history. And
Georgia, do you have time for one more question?
sure, go ahead.
So Max, we have, you probably know that in Sonoma, we have a mission. And so we have a very, you know, historical town square. And right across from the mission are a group of houses that is in complete disrepair that used to house artists. And there's been a kind of a move undercurrent of let's repair those and, you know, house teachers or house, you know, police officer, somebody. And a local architect, Ned Forrest, has already drawn up all the plans ready to go. And the city can't do it because it is on state historic property. The state determines what to do. So what would be the best avenue for us to move forward with the state to have them approve us building something for low-income people?
Well, I would definitely, you know, contact your state senator or assembly person, you know, because that's the best avenue to get,
Okay.
you know, towards the state. But yeah, I mean, that sounds like an interesting situation, because the state is, you know, on the one hand urging, you know, lots of people to, or, you know, cities to build more housing. But if they have, you know, these assets right in the middle of neighborhoods that they're not letting development happen on, you know, that's sort of hypocritical, right? And I think we see that with a lot of things, is there's a lot of, you know, public land that's sort of underutilized that we could look at, you know, as opportunities to build new housing.
Right. Well, they also said that they really couldn't limit it to teachers or firefighters or whatever, because that was discriminatory. They had to leave it open for everybody.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'd have to know the particulars of that situation, but I mean, yeah, usually, you know, you can put in a certain income limit, but it's hard to, you know, because of the Fair Housing Act and other things, sort of like be too prescriptive about exactly who can live there.
Right.
Yeah.
But there could, I mean, obviously, if they're building a certain type of housing, you're not going to find the real wealthy wanting to buy in there anyway.
Oh, no, no.
They won't get in the way, let's put it that way. They've got.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, yeah, and that's kind of one of the points of the book, right? Is, you know, people, you know, more modestly sized buildings, right? They're kind of more inherently affordable because, you know, very wealthy people don't want to live in them.
Exactly. Yeah, like the little tiny tower.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, that staircase sounds like a fire escape.
Yeah, it's not for everyone, but and you know, these are just sort of regional examples, right? I think a tiny tower might look pretty out of place in
Well, Sonoma for
Sonoma,
sure.
right? But you know, there's other models. You know, I mean, one I really like is, you know, bungalow courts, where, you know,
Yes,
take a 50 by
yes.
100-foot lot and you can build, you know, 4 or 6, you know, very small little cottages clustered around a courtyard, and they all have, you know, their little own open space, and they have light and even this little social space. And it's, you know, at a small scale, right, where you could fit that into a single family neighborhood and walk past it and it wouldn't really even stick out. But
You know, we do have that in Sonoma right off of our bike path. We have, remember that, you know, that little row of houses, the small houses.
Mhm.
So we do have that, and they're affordable, aren't they?
I don't know.
Yeah, they are. I know someone who lived in them. And people don't usually leave them until they die. Sometimes they do, but because the rent is so good on these. So we do have we have an example of it in our town. We just need more of it. And I think
yeah,
that's exactly what you're talking about. It's these little bungalows. They're small spaces, don't have much square footage, but
yeah. And I
they're
think when we're talking about political activism, right, and how we want our neighborhoods to grow, you know, that's something where you can, you know, it's not like this foreign intrusion on Sonoma. It's something, you know, you can point to this existing building type. You know, that's probably, you're not allowed to build that now if you wanted to, but, you know, go to your city council and say, you know, we'd like more of these, you know, let's
that's
make these legal to build again.
we want more of those. Exactly right. So anyone else? I think we're about at the hour, so we're just about done. But I will send the recording to you. I'm going to stop the recording at this point.